The groundwork has been laid, so let's look at some garments and some adornments. We're also going to get a couple of stories out of the next section or two of the lecture. Sculpture of the time and vase paintings, artistic depictions of ancient Greece show how highly stylized, right, it was. It was known as geometric art, and it provides a lot of information about dress at the time, and we're able to draw some conclusions about dress at the time. We do see that it was very flowing. It also could be very ornate, that even though it was flowing, there was a lot of belting, especially right under the breast, belting. So there was some cinching that was done in a manner that is a little bit different than the Egyptians, that although they were draped garments, they did use some fasteners, some decoration to help keep those garments in place. We'll use those words, in place. And the hair was curly, and it seems as if that's just an ethnic characteristics that the Greeks of the time had very curly hair. So when we see depictions of goddesses, we see depictions of everyday folk, right? So if you think about some of the images that we've seen in the previous slides, we see that the hair does appear to be curly. It may be put up, but it may be curly. And men and both women wore their hair curly, sometimes, tied into a braid or a knot, lock at the back of their neck. But there were high, tall, plume-like. They were elaborate. They were elaborate. So, we depend on this art to draw some conclusions. And in this classical period, we have plenty of representations of what people wore based on what has survived. And much unlike the Egyptians and the Chinese and the Indians, their artistic expression was oftentimes done large scale, right, and in marble. So the image that we see here on the left, this is another depiction of the goddess Nike. This one is at the Louvre Museum in Paris, and this picture doesn't do it justice. The scale of this sculpture is huge. I would easily say it's about 20 feet tall. I think the pedestal alone is 6 or 8 feet high. So this is a large scale representation of what typical, actually what royal and wealthy people wore in this classical period. Let's look at some garments. So the first garment that we see here is known as a peplos. It was a garment that was primarily worn by women during, the early classical period up to about 300 BCE, depending on who your source is. And it's a draped garment. Again, it's a rectangular piece of material folded, that's hung from the shoulders, so it has a really wide overfold, and then it's belted around the waist, usually right underneath where it was folded. Sometimes a belt was placed on top of it, but it is a draped garment. The next garment we're going to look at is called a chiton, and Greek art and literature show that, again, it underwent a number of changes. If you look at the garments, they're really just versions of the same kind of draped garment, and so there are various types of these garments over time. In the first chiton that we looked at, though, it's fastened at the shoulder. There's oftentimes there's decoration, so small weights at the end of the drapery. And there's a story that I'm going to tell a couple, probably the next slide. There's a story that claimed that this style was abandoned because of an incident that happened in the story. So we'll get that. You'll get that story in the next, probably in the next slide, if not the next slide, the slide after that, right? And then, we see two different versions of the chitin. And again, it's belted, it's high-waisted, it's under the breast, it's generally made of lightweight fabric that molds to the body. And we see this is a Greek goddess dress, right? I mean, it's a goddess dress that we still wear to this day, right? The other type of garment that was worn predominantly by men, but also by women is a himitation. Again, it's a large rectangle fabric. Better known, it's a toga, right? It's what we call a toga. And this garment was widely used in Greece in the before the Common Era. And there are various methods for draping that are depicted by artists. But if we look at the garments that are worn for women and the garments that are worn for men, they are just a translation of each other. And again, when we think of classical Greek clothing, right, or we think of these type of goddess dresses and togas, and again, we see that these are wrapped garments, right, and which is a theme throughout history. And in the next slide, I'm gonna relay a story about some of the decoration that they used to use or stopped using, that kind of transformed the iteration of this dress. So I've alluded to this story a couple times. It's I don't want to say it's funny. It's just very interesting. And Herodotus was a Greek historian. He wrote histories of contemporary time. So he really was writing stories of contemporary time that we now use as historical documents for ancient Greece. And in his book, The History of Persian Wars, he tells a story of how the women of Athens, why they went from one style of dress to another. And basically what the story is there was a war that the Greeks were fighting the Persians, and when the Greeks were defeated, we'll just say that the Greeks were defeated, and only one soldier came back to the city of Athens. So one soldier came back. He survived the slaughter of all his compatriots and colleagues, and when he came back, the women of Athens are like, well, how did you survive, right? How did you survive the slaughter? And in their grief, they crowded around the man, took the brooches, the pins that were holding up their dresses, and started to stab him. And stabbed him and asked him, where have you left my husband? Why did you leave my husband on the battlefield? And he died. He died that way. And Athenians, Athenian men, the folks that were left, or actually the people that weren't involved in this situation, thought that it was horrible, and that the deed was actually worse than the men being defeated in battle by the Persian. And as a result, they had a mandate that women were required to wear a tunic of linen that doesn't require a brooch to keep it closed. So men been trying to control how we dress up forever. I mean, I'm not gonna say this is a good reason, but they didn't want to get stabbed. That's part of the reason why they made that change. So I won't say I love that story, but I do love that story because it shows us that even in contemporary times, historians saw or had a good rationale for why dress needed to change. So that's the first story. We're gonna get one more story about our friend Hera. She's a goddess. We'll get a story about Hera in a few more slides.